Welcome, Niels. I'm very glad to have you with us today to talk about digital society. You are today a member of parliament for the Centre Party, and I thought maybe the first question for you is to introduce yourself to us and what you do.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for having me. Well, my name is Niels, and as you said, I'm a member of parliament, elected from Malmö, the fair city of the southern part of Sweden. When it comes to what I do, I'm in two basic committees in the parliament, and one of them is education, and the other one is the business side of the parliament. But I'm also responsible for the digital questions for the Centre Party, spokesperson for digital questions or subjects. And for me, the basic part of it is to make sure that the understanding of the consequences of digitalization of society reaches a higher level in the parliamentary system, because whatever question we are dealing with in the parliament, digitalization is a part of it. And to the most part, I would say that is still not recognized, that many parts of legislation or debates, etc., are still based on a world that is basically analog, and in the society that we do live, which is a digital society, many things change, and then we have to do legislation, that we have our understanding of the world and the consequences of legislation must change. So I try to work a lot with changing perspectives on different kinds of matters, basically. That's what I try to do most of all.
Yeah, and you are a member of the Centre Party here in Sweden. Just as basic knowledge here, how did you get involved in politics? Was that the interest from your early childhood as well?
Well, I've always been interested in society and probing questions about how society works and what kind of ideas we live, what are the norms and why are they there, etc. Questioning things. I'm a very curious person, but I've never been involved. I moved to Sweden in 2006 from Denmark, and I've never been involved in a political party in Denmark. But when I moved here, then I thought, oh, that's a good way to get to know a society. So I read up under the different parties, and I'm sort of like a liberal person in the European understanding, but also probably in the American understanding. Not that leftist on economic questions, but very liberal when it comes to values and the basic idea about speech, etc., free speech, etc. So. And I do believe that the climate is a very important question for us as well. So those things combined made the Centre Party the most relevant party for me. And then it's like we weren't elected into the parliament from Malmö, where I live, and we weren't in the local politics either. But we are now, since this election. We've had a long development phase. So I've been involved in regional and local politics mostly, but also often with a digital twist. So that's my political background.
And as a member of the parliament, you mentioned some of the focus area in your role. Could you elaborate a little more on that?
Well, I chose education, the area of education, because in Malmö, where I come from, there's a lot of kids that do not get a proper education. So we have areas where there's a lot of people living a bit outside of society. And a lot of the kids, we have schools there with only 30% that gets some years that have been that have had an education that makes it possible for them to get to the next level in high school, etc. And I think that is deplorable. So I chose that to change some of the legislation on that area, and we have had some success in changing some rules, etc. And then the other thing was that I wanted to make sure that the digital understanding in Parliament increased. So that's why I chose the business part of society, of Parliament as well. That committee, it would be called in English, in the American system anyway. Yeah. So that's why I chose that. Because a lot of questions is there.
Yeah. And you mentioned also your second role, besides education, you are educating on the digitalization and the digital
Yes.
society. And I just would like to start in this area. We talk a lot about for digitalization, and it's a broad and open concept. What does that mean to you, digitalization?
Well, I think it's one understanding of it, and I think it probably has to be used in many different ways in different arenas, because one part of it is when you take something that is analog and you turn it into something digital. You take a piece of paper and it goes from an analog book into a digital book, but the most important part of it, in my view, is when something becomes truly digital, especially from our point of view as legislators, I believe, is that the important thing is for society, and the change is not that you read a book on a tablet instead of reading it on paper. That is not a shift of understanding or of perspective. Whereas when you use the consequences of it being on a tablet, meaning that, okay, so now we do get the possibility to track the reading speed of a pupil. We get a possibility of collecting the speed with which all our students write, or the number of errors they do when they write words, etc. And we can see that in this school, the probability of learning to write by the 5th grade is this high, and in this school it's this high. And we can see that the level which the skill is rising, the speed with which you get the skill of writing or reading is much faster with this teacher than with that teacher. Then we can start to have a much more analytical and science-based approach to education. And that is just one little example where, it's when it gets truly digital, and when it has become truly digital, it also means that if you start making the education system based on that kind of numerals or analytics, then you can no longer return to the book, because then that system does not work anymore. Then you have become truly digitalized or digitized. And that is where we are approaching in a lot of areas. And the understanding of that and the consequences of it is, in my view, is still very low in the parliamentary system. For instance, that when it comes to basic infrastructure, that, well, if our entire system is based on digital systems or understandings, then of course we must have a more robust system for the transfer of data. And the system for transferring of data today and the stability of networks, etc., is still very, very low, to a degree that we would never accept in other kinds of infrastructure. So there's a lot of consequences of that shift. That is that means that you have to go into the physical world as well and change things. And that shift, I do believe, is still. There's still a lot of people who do not understand the consequences. I do not, of course, understand all the consequences. Far from it. But I do understand that there are consequences of it that is beyond the physical world, and that we have to change our concepts of each, of everything, basically. When everything becomes digitalized, truly, then there's a lot of things that we could do before that we cannot do anymore. But most of all, there are a lot of things that we could not do that we now can do. And the speed of innovation in the legislative system is very low compared to what it is in the outside world.
And you mentioned a little bit some of the examples of becoming more digitized. I thinking about, as a citizen, my behavior changes when things are becoming more digitalized. When you have tools to do that, you can now go online and do a lot of things. You can interact with your municipality through digital tools. Do you think digitalization will empower people more than before?
Well, in many ways, it already has. I do believe there are a lot of ways. I mean, we've had freedom of speech in Sweden for a long time, but with the new tools of where it's possible for more actors to create a national arena for discussion and debate, of course, the freedom of speech has increased, which is positive. Then there are a lot of sites, etc., that I do not like and what they write. But in terms of freedom of speech and the possibility of having a free debate, it's very positive. So it's no longer possible for semi-elite locally or nationally to limit the questions that are to debate, which is positive. So that's just one little aspect. So I do believe in many ways it will be easier for people to get access to advice on health, etc., if we manage to get a proper system. What I do fear is that in the way it's heading now, where the public system, which is paid by all of us, it's still stuck in some sort of limbo between the analog and the digital, which means that there's a lot of system errors. That means that there are some systems, there are some ways into the healthcare system that is paid for all of us, but is primarily used by those with good connections or with with a high understanding of the digital world. And we have to make sure that the fair access to healthcare is also coming into the digital world, which we've had in the analog or physical world. And for instance, I am absolutely certain that there will be a very big global market on healthcare for the monetized people, whereas for those who do not have money, it will still be other ways where in Sweden we have a public financed healthcare. And I think there will be, if we are not careful, there will be a big divide between those who have money and those who do not in the access to healthcare. So there's a lot of these things when things become global and you're no longer limited to the local health care system, which happens to be near you, but you have access to a global healthcare system as long as it's digital. I do believe that will have enormous consequences, and we are nowhere near having an understanding of what it means or how we should handle it in a system where we want it to be equal access to healthcare.
Mm-hmm. And with that, we have also, let's say, for example, the healthcare, but also in other sectors, there are a lot of
absolutely.
platform.
It's the same.
Yeah. So there are a lot of platform-based actors. We have in communication, we have Facebook, we have in also nowadays we talk a lot about gig economy with also Airbnb and other platform-based actors. How do you mentioned a little bit about fair and equal access to this? How do you see that we can create a fair and equal rules when it comes to usage of this platform-based actors?
Well, one of the things that I think we'll see more legislation and we've seen the European Union starting to take steps as well, is when it comes to the monopolies. Because what happens, the digital world is pushed towards monopoly or near monopoly status, because the advantages of putting your house on air or your apartment on Airbnb compared to any competitor is enormous, because their reach is so much bigger. Whereas as long as you're going after local actors, there's a larger possibility of many actors. So digital quite often goes towards monopolies in many areas. Same as, Wikipedia has more or less monopoly in that area on a global scale. Google has it. Facebook more or less has it. China is, and some other countries are exceptions, but in the classic Western world, Facebook has more or less monopoly in some sorts of platform systems, and that is something where we have to be very careful, because monopolies are bad, always have been and always will be. So I do believe there are certain parts of the digital economy where the legislational system has to ramp up the powers. At the same time, it is hard to stop people from choosing something voluntarily. And a lot of the platforms add values to many people. So we also have to be careful with what we do so we don't stop it.
And also the trade-off, I mean, because some of these technologies, they are very useful and bring value, but at the same time, we also talk about taxing, taxes of when you do you put your house on Airbnb or you take a gig economy work. How do you see like the policies needs to change to handle this transformation?
Well, in Sweden we have a basic we have a rule that says that as long as you pay someone, for instance, below 999 kronas, you don't have to report it to the IRS, the tax system. So in a gig economy, many people will continuously be below that. And then it's up to the ones who takes the money to report it, who gets the money, who's paid to report it to the IRS, and it's we can see that is not often done. And I absolutely believe that we have to find a way to legislate and make sure that we do not create a secondary economical system that is outside of the tax system, where if you take your job in one way, you're paid highly, you're paid and you do not tax, and if you're employed in another way, you are paid and taxed. That of course is not sustainable. So we have to do legislation that makes sure that whether it's Foodora, if it's Airbnb or any other, Uber or whatever it is, that those transactions are taxed in a similar way to normal, either having your own company or being employed. It's absolutely necessary.
And also within this digital economy, I read, I think last week, that there are a lot of voices concerning about whatever we do on the internet online, we are being tracked when it comes to the data. We don't own the data. Do you see there's a need to change this, that maybe we should have some kind of account where we have our own data, and today, because it's taken basically for free by some of the actors we have mentioned, like also in online with Facebook and Google. Do you see a need to change in that perspective as well?
Well, it's of course the first thing we have to be very clear with is that it's voluntary to be part of those systems. You do not have to log in to use Google, etc., and so on. Facebook, you do not need to have to be a citizen, etc. So there is an important aspect in that you voluntarily choose to give up your information. You're not forced to do it to be a citizen or something like that. So that's the part about that. And I do not think that it's a problem in itself that the companies have data on you. What is important is, of course, the possibility to have it erased, and we have that legislation is in place now in the European Union in many ways. What is worked on now is, of course, that where Google, Facebook, and many others are involved is the transferring of data between systems. That's also related to the monopoly system. And there is now they are working together to find a common transferring system, making it possible to transfer your data between systems, making it easier for you to opt out of one system and enter into another one, which from the perspective of the individual and again concerning monopolies is very positive. Because that would make it easier for a new actor to get in as well, in theory anyway. So I mean, it isn't that easy to say exactly what kind of legislation you need, and I don't think that it's, I mean, the basic idea is, of course, that you should own your own data and you have the right to have it removed. But that doesn't mean that you have to that. I mean, if you make one place where it's all positioned, which is a theoretical idea, someone has to own that as well. And I do not believe it would necessarily be better if the government owned all your data, or that site where it was. It could, of course, be Wikipedia, etc., that kind of organization. that has it, but there will always be interests in that data unless you pay for the storage of it, where it's pure payment that makes it sort of like make it tick. But yeah, I'm not sure that would be a possibility either. And we know that in almost all systems there have been leaks of data. So of course it would not, if you collect all your data in one place and that place is leaked, then the consequences of that leak would be much larger than if the data is separated into different systems. So it's not that easy, and no system is ever idiot-proof, ever.
But also we can hear now what from our discussion is very complex. It's very complex issues here, and you said that one of your job is to make to bring awareness in these questions. Do you think when it comes to the politicians we have in Sweden that we need to become more aware of these questions?
Absolutely. That's why I've sort of like started a network in the parliament on digitalization, where we have different seminars, etc., on various issues that are going to be on our table sooner or later. It can be very different issues, but where there's a clear digital like underlining of it. And I do believe that all of us, and myself very much included, needs a lot more information and understanding on digital issues. Most parliamentarians have grown up in a less digital world than what it is today, even if we have a very young parliament in Sweden compared to most countries. But all legislation, there's very little legislation that was born in the digital world. Most of it has been born in an analog world. We've seen in the European Union when it comes to copyright that you sort of like took a new complete wrap around the digital world of copyright, which is very, very good. There are some issues with it, which I'm sure everybody who listens to this are aware of, and we've been clear on that there's an issue with the copyright and the free speech in the suggestion that is there, and we still don't have a Swedish proposition on how it's supposed to be in Sweden. And the Commission has still not given all the directions for how to translate the legislation into national law. So there's a lot of these things that present new challenges. The basic idea of much legislation on the digital world in the European Union is that the ideas that legislation has for how the world should function in the analog world, the same basic values, etc., should be taken into the digital world as well. So if we have a copyright that makes it illegal to copy something in the physical world, then it should be illegal to copy it in the digital world as well. And I think that is a rather good basic idea to build on. If it comes, for instance, with monopolies, etc. So if you think it's bad with monopolies in the physical world, it's probably bad in the digital world as well. But we do not always follow that. For instance, when it comes to the copyright situation, where in the digital world you want the companies to preemptively stop breaches of the law of copyright, where actually in the analog world you would never demand that of anyone. You would never demand that a market where the books are sold, or you have a flea market, that they should have to check every single object coming into that flea market to see if there's a copyright infringement. Whereas if you see on the flea market that there's obvious copyright infringement, you would expect them to say you cannot sell that here. But in the digital world, you said that you have to stop it at the gate. So there's a lot of, you do not always follow that rule from the European Union either. So that kind of problem we'll see in many ways, I think.
And going forward in the next area, we look at Sweden. Today, what kind of initiatives are underway or going to take place in the future when it comes to related to digitalizations? You mentioned some of the network you are working with, but are there other initiatives around Sweden?
Well, first, there's the Swedish version of the copyright issues. We have right now, one of the things that would be very interesting is there's been a new, we are going to have on open data, which has very big possible consequences and possibilities for Sweden. We've gone from it's okay to open your data to you have to open your data, basically. Then of course there are limits, etc., and we have to discuss exactly how to do it. But that change is very, very positive. There will also be very financial consequences of it, since many authorities have their basic income from the sale of data, and if they have to put it out free, then of course we have to fund them differently, etc. So there's a lot of consequence of that. So that on open data, I do believe would be very, very interesting for everybody involved in digitalization to follow. One thing that will also be interesting, I believe, is to see how we are gonna make sure that the basic infrastructure is in place with 5G, with more robust internet connections, etc. Is one example, which is like connecting the physical and the digital world, which is it's the basics. We cannot have a good system, a good digital economy if the basic infrastructure is not there. And then there's one thing that hasn't really been talked about a lot, but the government gave a instruction to Skolverket and some other authorities as well, together with the representative for the municipalities and regions, to finally get together and find a way to find common standards and for the public systems, so that the interoperability in our systems in government, regional, healthcare, and the municipal level increases, and hopefully the transferring of data will be much easier. And that, I believe, if it's done right, can have very positive effects. So that's going to be very interesting to follow as well, as examples.
Yeah, and from your broad perspective, Niels, when it comes to do you think like Sweden have a clear strategy when it comes to digitalization? What is the first short-term and long-term planning? Do you see that today being in place?
Well, I do believe there are quite good strategies, and the basic idea is that the problem with strategies is that a strategy doesn't have any effect if you don't have a plan and money to get through, and that's the big problem, isn't it? That, for instance, we created the digital authority, DIG, a few years ago, but they were hardly monetized at all, but still given a lot of responsibility. Now they get more money in the new budget that we've just made, but there's a lot of mismatches between the strategies we have in Sweden and the actual monetization following it. But I do believe the basic strategies are often quite right, but also very broad. So I'm more concerned about the actual following through than the beautiful words in the strategies.
And looking at also when it comes to my personal work, I work a lot with companies in the manufacturing sector, and when you say that how can for example there be more policies that can create more collaboration between the public and private sector when it comes to making maybe innovation partnership or seizing new opportunities? Do you see that there can be more done in this area?
Absolutely. Some of it, of course, is Vinnova and other authorities making sure that they actually, and universities not least, being a lot better at opening up to common projects. There's a lot of silos in that world still that really shouldn't be. I do believe that the open data is such an example where you can have enormous common possibilities, but where the first thing for the government and the authorities is to open up. And now with the data open and freely available, then the companies can use it. And many times they can do solutions that would be a great use for the authorities themselves. I have myself placed suggestions to Parliament that it should be easier to this public, inköp, well, when the government buys from companies,
Yeah.
there's in Sweden our laws are more strict than they have to be according to European law. So we have for so like many innovation, a lot of innovation can be done quite cheaply. You don't have to spend tens of millions on some solutions. But in Sweden, we have public procurement. Our rules on public procurement are very strict, also down to low levels of cost. So that means that if you have to buy something for $1 million, for instance, you have to go through a big process, which means that a lot of innovators do not want to get in there because it's just too difficult. Whereas the European legislation that we have to follow only says that you have to follow like the basic 5 principles of non-discrimination, openness, etc. And if we use that up to the max level where we are allowed to according to the European legislation, it would be so much easier to if someone wants to if you come as a company to a municipality and say, this thing over here, we could try to make a solution for you that would do these marvelous things that you don't do today. And it'll cost you about $500,000 for us to do it in this innovation project. And if it's good, we can sell it to all other municipalities and make money on it. That would be so much easier if we change that law. And I do believe that I am a big fan of freedom. Rather than having all sorts of different projects with funding where you can apply for money, etc. I do believe it's much easier if the freedom is given to the public sector and the companies to work together and find common solutions in innovation where it's needed and when it's needed, instead of applying for funds from the government or some authority. So that's basically one thing that I do believe we have to change with the speed of innovation that is in digitalization.
Yeah,
and will increase.
And looking ahead, maybe I've mentioned some of the things. What important policy issues are you driving today in your work?
Well, we have as the only party, I'm responsible for digital amendment. It probably called, but sort of like a suggestion for legislative. I can't speak now. Legislation, digital legislation. It's called Digitalisation in the Riksdags database. There will be a new one now where we go through almost a lot of different subjects where things have to change. I think we have about 60 different points in it of things we would like to change that are purely digital, which is some of it is security based, some of it is the way the public sector works. It's like, if you get married, why do we have to do everything in paper now still? You can't just use everybody in Sweden has a digital ID, almost everyone, but you cannot use it when you have the sector, and this means that a lot of paper gets lost and people are not registered as married even if they are, etc. There's a lot of problem with this paper trail, which would disappear straight away. I marry people myself, and if I write their names wrong, their names will be wrong. If I write the wrong date, that is what wrong. And if I post it and PostNord, it disappears in their system, then they are not married. and they are not notified when it's registered, so they do not know if they have been registered, if they do not take a control for themselves. So it's high and low, really. So that's the framework of what I do. And there, the big issues on open data and copyright, etc., are there as well. So that is the framework for the things that I'm pushing in Parliament. Then, of course, there's the suggestions from the government comes, and you have to see what has to be done on that.
Yeah, we look forward to follow your work. It's a very interesting areas, and it's this current topic as well, because it's the change or the pace of the changes are really happening very fast, and we see a lot of new, as you mentioned, innovation. And it brings value, of course, to the citizen, but also I think for Sweden to become more when it comes to the manufacturing as well. Definitely.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of. I mean, we've hardly started on the optimization of public decision making. So, like in the social systems, etc., and in school systems, and when we, of course, this is so like you have to really get it right. I mean, this is very important stuff. This can decide whether a person gets money for their house, or also like gets funding for their rent or not from the government. So it's very important that you get it right. But at the moment, we increase the number of people working for the government every year, and highly increase it. So, and at the same time, we are starting to like we are reaching the top of the possibility of taxing people more, and our municipalities are on a deficit, etc. So we saw like we are on the edge of what is possible to finance in the public sector. It might be possible to take a little more money also, like, but so we have to find new ways of innovation, and optimization, etc. is absolutely necessary to get it rolling. It will increase, it has the possibility to increase the security in the decision making, that people get what they actually have the right to according to law, etc. And it's a bit much easier to monitor, and we can save a lot of money in the systems as well. So I do believe there's a lot of possibilities of innovation, but it's going to take some time before we're there.
Yeah, and also when I meet a lot of different companies, they mention education, reskilling as the number one, maybe one of the first on the list there. Do you think that when it comes to education, where we have the traditional system today, and now people with aging, they need to reskill more often than before? Do you think there is a change also in how that system works?
Yeah, but the problem is that my absolute opinion is that the universities in Sweden are they're caught in the old world still. I mean, I'm part of so like not the management, but so like a board, you could say, of a vocational education in Malmö Yrkeshögskola, and I was like, we've published every single hour of education we have published for all current and prior students for more than 10 years. And there's hardly any university in Sweden that does anything on publishing the knowledge that we all pay for them to create or so like educate the rest of us in. So you have to sort of like get in, even if it's all tax paid, they're trying to lock in the information rather than open it. And at the same time, it's possible for me to study for free, basically, at Stanford. And the MOOCs, etc. There's still such a long way. So in that, so like when it comes to higher education, I do believe Sweden is so far behind, very, very far behind. When it comes to schools, normal, so like public schools, etc., I do believe there's a lot of possibilities away as well. But that's not so much reskilling. But one of the things that we've managed is that in the vocational education, we've had a lot more so like shorter courses, financed much better. It became easier with Corona to get that through, which is reskilling. And what that does is that if you want to, so like when the school where I'm part of this board is like we focus on programming in mobile solutions. And normally that's just boys or men, basically. Very few women. If we try to push it as programming, if we try to push it, you learn how to create solutions for marketing. More girls apply, which is wonderful because they're very different perspectives and very different kind of people who come in. When we now you do the short courses where it's like what after many years we managed to get in tourism, for instance, the digital tourism, which is, all tourism is digital now. Nobody travels and then goes to the local office to ask where to go. Everybody's planned their vacation in advance. So if you want to be successful in tourism, you have to be digital first now. So we try to teach people solutions in that, what you can do, what you can program, etc. Also, different kind of tourist solutions based on positioning as well, etc. And that was hard to get through because, in the system, you don't see that everything has to be digital. You see more like people have to learn to program. But what we see is that every single kind of business has to be digital. So every single kind of knowledge has to have employee has to have a level of digitalization on top of their current knowledge. And what we see now with the short courses where we digitalize, for instance, education or tourism, etc., a lot more women, because they can use their existing skill and then get a reskill or upskill of that, more upskill basically actually. And that means that we have, it's finally possible to get the entire population into the system. Otherwise, it would just be the tech boys. And all respect for tech boys, but they only cover so much, and they do not always know the business. They know how to create solutions, but they don't know. They're not always as good at knowing what is the end consumer's value of it, or what is the business value of it. That in that you need the rest of the people, and that when it comes to courses on distance, digital courses, shorter, it's much easier to get the entire populace into it, and that is going to revolutionize everything. I do believe that is that is the way to lift the entire population, and not just the tech boys. And women, of course, as well, but it's mostly the boys.
Yeah, so very interesting examples, and we very much look forward that you bring awareness and you drive this important issues as well. So with that, Niels, I think I want to thank you for participating and being with us today. I think it's very interesting to see your perspective, and also it gives us hope that there is an awareness also in the parliament for you driving this work. And of course, I will put on your contact info that people can contact you and have more discussions. So is there anything you want to add before we finish here today?
No, I don't know. It's it's important for me that what you said, that it's very good to get in touch. If you if you think that there are issues that need to be addressed, it is very easy to get in touch. That is something that has also increased with the digital world. Yeah. It's a lot easier to get in touch with your local parliamentarian. That's a good thing.
Yes, of course. So with that,
and thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you for being with us, and have a pleasant day.
You too.